Welcome, Nick. Thanks for joining the Finding Elevation podcast. We've worked together off and on for a while, and it's great to get a chance to really pick your brain and share that with everybody else. So I always like to start at the beginning because I think how people ended up where they are is really fascinating. So you are an exercise physiologist at the Altitude Center in London. How is it that you came to study exercise physiology, and then how did you end up focusing specifically on hypoxic training?
That's a very good question. I ask myself that a lot. I always had a passion for sport. I've always been reasonably good at sport, but probably never quite good enough to make it, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I've always been fascinated around kind of human performance and what makes us as good as we are. Naturally led into kind of school or high school in the States through to college or university here, pursuing exercise physiology, and then I was lucky enough to actually be given the opportunity to work as a placement student here, or what you might know as an intern, back in 2017. From there, kind of fell in love with environmental extremes, so hot, cold, altitude, zero gravity, that side of things. Pursued that in my dissertation, and then came back here full time a few years ago now, and kind of do a lot of work in high altitude, which is how we've crossed paths, but also a lot of work in other extremes. So, for example, heat, hot, cold, stuff like that as well.
Very cool. So we're going to get into training for altitude, but can you explain for listeners what is going on physiologically when we are at altitude? What is going on in our bodies? What's the stress that we endure? How do we change? Give us like a background and all.
So probably the first place to start there is like, what is altitude? So obviously, as you climb and as you go through the different altitudes on whatever trip you are, the partial pressure of oxygen in the air that we breathe changes. Now, the total amount of oxygen doesn't change. There's still 20.9%. There's still 20.9 molecules for every 100. They're just more spread out. What that means basically is the relative percentage that we breathe drops. So good examples of like a few key places. So sea levels, 20.9% oxygen. Places people have heard of. So things like Boulder, which is in the US, which is kind of one of the US Olympic camps, or Denver, Mile High City. They're kind of 16% oxygen, or relative percentage of. Then as we move higher, Kili, 9.8%. Aconcagua, high 8, so 8.8, 8.9%, all the way through to like the big 8,000 or so. Top of Everest is 6.6%. You've got about a third, or 33% of the available oxygen, or the amount of the partial pressure-wise, the amount of oxygen there at that point. What that causes is, or what that's known as, is hypoxia. So hypoxia is the Latin term for like lack of oxygen in the body, or lack of oxygen per se. That causes multiple impacts on the human body. The most notable of which, and the one that people who have climbed before or have like an interest in altitude might have come across, is SpO2, or blood saturation. That's that number. If you ever climb, they keep shoving that sensor on your finger and then going, yeah, you look good. It's all about that number. What that tells you as a medic, or as a guide, or me as a physiologist, is basically the amount of oxygen in somebody's body. From that, we can understand how somebody's coping, i.e. risk of altitude sickness, but we can also use it as a training method, or as a guide to how somebody's dealing with that environment. So in some situations, like in sporting situations, you want that number to come down to elicit adaptations such as red blood cells, or muscular adaptations around efficiency. Or on the mountains, you want that number to come down so the body makes adaptations to deal with altitude better. That's known as acclimatization. So then when either you go higher again, so if you're doing rotations on big mountains, or for like when you're in Nepal, for example, you'll go to Namche Bazaar, sleep there for a night, stay there for a day, and then climb again. It's all about trying to get that number as high as you can get it. The higher you can get that number, the more oxygen you can supply to the muscles, the more oxygen you can supply to the brain.
Yep. So our bodies at elevation are, as you said, there's not the same concentration of oxygen in the air.
Yeah.
So what we inhale is less than what we're acclimatized to.
Yeah, and then, relatively speaking.
And then as we put ourselves in these oxygen poor environments, there's some changes that our bodies undergo to say, oh my gosh, we need more oxygen. What are we going to do?
Yeah, exactly. You know, when you go to high altitude, you put your body in a situation that it isn't comfortable with. As a physiologist, what you say, you put your body in a stressful situation, or under stress. You know, your body doesn't like being under stress. It doesn't like having its blood saturation, or it doesn't like having less oxygen in itself. Therefore, what it does is it makes adaptations to either take more oxygen from the air, use the oxygen that you've got in your body better, transport it around the body better. It tries to make itself more efficient to make the
Yep.
most of the oxygen that it has. So then as you climb higher and higher and higher, you can deal with the lower and lower levels of oxygen better, because you've made those adaptations lower down or in training.
Yep. And it's the release of a hormone, I believe, called EPO.
Yeah, so that's one avenue. So one avenue of acclimatization is known as hematological or blood changes. That is
Mhm.
triggered by that famous hormone EPO. When your blood saturation drops, it triggers what's known as an EPO cycle. That triggers typically bone marrow to produce more red blood cells. Red blood
Mhm.
cells are what carry the oxygen around the body. So over a longer expedition, you'll grow more red blood cells. By growing more red blood cells, you can kind of carry more oxygen around the body.
It's remarkable to me how our bodies adapt as we
They
stressful situations.
Yeah, the human body, A, is very, very clever, and B, does it very, very quickly. And it's
Yeah.
very, very good at, in a very short period of time, being able to deal with quite an extreme environment very, very quickly.
And as you're training people in
Mhm.
hypoxic environments, what adaptations are you looking for? What changes do you want to see to make sure they're adapting?
Yeah, so we typically tend to target two types of adaptation or two pathways. One of those we've just spoke upon, which is kind of that hematological, that blood adaptation. That's caused by prolonged exposure. So that's when you sleep in hypoxic tents, or if you're on a
Mhm.
real expedition, or you're doing like an acclimatization climb. So it's become quite common now for somebody who's climbing Everest to go and climb the Boucher East or Mera Peak beforehand. What that's all
Mhm.
about is starting to trigger that EPO cycle that we just spoke about, start to grow some more red blood cells, increase your oxygen carrying capacity, therefore get more oxygen to the brain, more oxygen to the muscles. So that's the first pathway, prolonged exposure, and that's hematological or changes to the blood. The second pathway is through intermittent exposure. That's typically where we get your blood saturation to drop a little bit lower than we may normally see during sleep through very high altitudes and exercise. And that's all about causing muscular adaptation. So that's all about causing adaptations in and around oxygen efficiency. The most notable of which that people might have heard of are around the mitochondria. So they're those powerhouses of your cell, if you think back to like high school biology. So you increase the number of them and you increase the efficiency of them. And the other thing you can see once you get a decent exposure to intermittent hypoxic exposure is an increase in VEGF. That's the hormone that grows more capillaries. So suddenly, not only have you got more red blood cells, prolonged exposure going around the body, but you've also got muscles that work better and are more efficient, and you've got more capillaries within those muscles to get fuel in and get waste products out.
Yes. And it's really important that both of those adaptations occur
Yep,
for us to be efficient. And
correct.
so you
Yeah,
mentioned some pre-acclimatization, which is what you do day in
yeah,
and day out.
yeah.
How do we actually accomplish that? What is it that you're
I think
prescribing?
it very much comes down to what's going to suit somebody best and what their long-term goal is. Because if you've got somebody climbing a massive mountain like Everest or K2 or Aconcagua or Denali, that's a very, very different program to somebody who's climbing Mount Rainier, for example.
Mhm.
And at the end of the day, like pre-acclimation isn't for everybody, because if you deal with altitude really, really well, or aren't trying any of these new kind of styles of ascent, then for a lot of people and in a lot of history of mountaineering, people have climbed absolutely fine. Where pre-acclimatization has its value is in certain positions. So if you've got an individual who knows they deal with altitude very, very badly, we can look to work with that individual to build a foundation and build a base in their home, so home country, even home is in house, to
Mhm.
then send them off to the mountain partly pre-acclimatized. If you've got an individual who has never climbed before but is going to quite high altitude, so for example, you're doing your very first time, you're off to Kilimanjaro, we can put somebody through some testing to find out how well they deal with altitude, what their genetic tolerance is, and then from there, if they're at risk of altitude sickness, we can do some pre-acclimatization. If they're not, it's not something to worry about. If we've got an individual who's looking to give themselves the best chance of summiting, whether they've climbed before or not, you can use pre-acclimatization to, again, reduce the stress. You'll hear me say that word quite a lot today, but reduce the amount of stress they put on the body. So I've worked with climbers before who are, for example, going off to Everest, who are doing standard 50-day Everest expeditions. So, risk of altitude sickness is suppressed because they've got a very, very long expedition. But what these
Mhm.
guys and girls want to do is they want to get to base camp. They want to get to camp one. They want to get to camp two as fresh as possible. They want to have burnt as fewer matches as possible. And one way you can do that is if you reduce the amount of stress that altitude puts elements on the body, the risk of respiratory infection is lower, the risk of muscular injury is lower, the risk of chronic fatigue is lower. So you've got that element there. And then the final element around pre-acclimation, and one where I've worked a lot in his recent years due to its increase in popularity, is rapid ascent. So people are looking to climb these very, very big mountains in very, very short periods of time. So I've worked on Everest expeditions that have lasted less than 15 days. I've worked on Aconcagua expeditions that have lasted 6, 7, 8 days. I had somebody climb an 8,000er in Nepal this year. Kathmandu to Kathmandu was less than a week. So the new trend, the new way that mountaineering has been going in recent years is to climb mountains very, very quickly. Notable reason for that is typically around time away from home, annual leave, time away from family. Like a 50-day expedition is hard to fit into life. A 21 or a 28-day expedition might be a little bit easier for some people.
And you, in the beginning of that, you noted genetic testing, which I
Yes.
think is very interesting as well. Talk more about
Yes.
that and what you're looking
Yeah.
for.
So somebody's ability to deal with altitude is completely genetic. It's one of the biggest misconceptions you see is that people go, I'm fit, I'll be fine. Sadly, it doesn't quite work like that. Being really physically fit is really important, because if you're
Yep.
not fit enough, you're not going to summit. It's as simple as that. Like if your body lets you down, you're not going to summit. However, like it's not the only part of a puzzle. And when it comes to putting a plan together for big mountaineering, the way that we do it here is you look at part one is the physical fitness, part two is the tolerance to altitude. Now, they are
Mhm.
separate elements that come together on the mountain to give you your perfect mountaineer. And if you look at any successful summiter of any big mountain, they are both very physically fit and deal with altitude very, very well. You won't find a climber who is incredibly fit and doesn't deal with altitude very well, or one who deals with altitude very well and isn't fit, because they're not
Right.
going to get. You need the combination of both. So for those climbing big mountains or even small mountains, anything kind of 4,000 meters plus, what we always recommend doing is start with some testing. Let's find out how your body deals with altitude, because if it deals with altitude really, really well, you can put one of those training elements aside. So you don't need to worry about it. Genetically, you're going to be one of those people who just doesn't struggle with altitude. Focus on the physical fitness, go and have fun, send us a photo. Equally, if the testing identifies somebody is at more risk of suffering altitude sickness, it depends on the degree, because if it's only really small, they can work with their guiding team, work with the team on location to manage and mitigate that risk as much as possible. Or if that risk is deemed big enough, we can then look at a pre-acclimation or pre-acclimatization strategy to reduce and manage that risk. So when they head out to the mountain, it's significantly lower.
And what are you measuring to determine the amount of risk for an individual?
Typically, the level of risk is determined by a couple of different factors depending on where an athlete's going. But the main factors we're going to look at is how an athlete feels, because their
Yep.
sensation is very important. And then from a clinical perspective, it's heart rate and blood saturation. There are some
Okay.
quite clear guidelines given in the literature around level of risk and how somebody copes with altitude. And then it's a case of using those guidelines to understand the type of trip somebody's doing. So, for example, climbing Kilimanjaro, Kili's notorious for a very, very fast rate of ascent. Or
Yep.
something like Everest Base Camp, which has maybe a slightly slower rate of ascent, we can manage and mitigate and take that into account and go from there.
Fascinating. I think it's great that you start with looking clinically at what a person is
Yeah,
genetically predisposed
it's
to.
the same with anything. Like if you're going to go and do a training plan, you need to get some sort of physiological data to understand your starting point, whether that be a
Yep.
field-based measure, like an FTP test for a cyclist, a 5K time trial for a runner, a VO2 max test if we look clinically. Same for altitude. Let's get some data to start with. Let's understand what we're working with, because at the end of the day, mountaineering is expensive. There's no getting away from that. And in the build up to an exhibition, time is always very, very poor. You know, if an athlete doesn't need to spend money or find the time to pre-acclimatize, there's absolutely no point in doing it. They're not going to get any real value or justification from it. Equally, if we find the data does indicate they're at risk, we can actually make a significant difference to their climb and significantly increase the chance of them summiting and the risk of or reduce the risk, of their level of AMS or risk of AMS.
And you mentioned, I think also importantly, that it doesn't acclimatize you to the summit necessarily.
No,
It really, the biggest benefit, I think, is making sure that you arrive at base camp as healthy as possible and with as much in the tank for the challenges ahead as possible.
yeah, for big mountains, that's the way it has to be done. Like the technology and the kit we use here on site can go up to about 6,500 meters. So you can
Mhm.
fully acclimatize somebody to 6,500 meters, because that's how high the machine goes. But over that point, it's making sure that they are as fresh as they can be for when things get going. So the analogy I normally use for people, take Everest for example, is I want you to get to Camp 3. I want you to get to 6,900 meters where people typically go on oxygen, having burned just fewer matches. But I want you to get to that point as ready as you can be and as fresh as you can be, because from there upwards, that's going to be your determinant of success. That's going to what's make the difference between your summit or your not summit. Most people
Right.
make it to 6-9. Most people on Everest make it to Camp 3. Not all of those people make the summit. I want the athletes that we've done what we do with, to get to that point as ready as they can be, having burnt as fewer matches, so to speak, as possible, and under the smallest amount of physical stress they can be, so they can then excel and they have the most amount of energy and the most reserves there for then kind of push to Camp
Yep.
4 or push to summit.
Yep.
Aconcagua is the same. I want somebody to get to high camp on Aconcagua as fresh as they can be, so when you get that really, really long day on Aconcagua, you're good to go. For
Yep.
mountains like Kili and Everest Base Camp, Cotopaxi, all those sort of climbs, you can fully acclimatise to the summit if needs be, because the machines go that high. But for those
Mhm.
mountains over 6.5, it's exactly as you said, just trying to get there as fresh and as ready as possible.
Because the other thing that hypoxic training cannot simulate is the drop in pressure
Correct.
that
Yeah.
we experience at altitude, which is what leads to a decrease in the oxygen that we're
Yeah.
inhaling.
Correct.
But it also affects us physiologically. We're used to a certain amount of pressure,
Yeah.
and we don't have it, things can get a little haywire.
Yeah, and that's potentially one of the shortfalls is one reason for it. But again, there's some interesting literature showing that kind of under 7,500 meters, the body can kind of manage that. Over 7,500 meters, it becomes a bit trickier. But there's no way you can get ready for that. That's one of the challenges of mountaineering. Like, you're putting your body in a situation where, let's be honest, at the heights that we're discussing here, like, humans aren't supposed to be there. Like, we're not supposed to be there, and we're not there for very long. Like,
Yep.
you're putting yourself in a position where 99% of people are going to be on supplemental oxygen anyway. And then, yeah, when you see those pressure changes, that's where other factors can come in. But again, those gradual acclimatizations, and the body responds really quite nicely. So even in some of these rapid ascents that we see nowadays, it doesn't tend to play too much of a part. And over recent years, we've had a higher percentage success rate on rapid ascents than standard ascents, indicating that probably that pressure isn't as much of a determinant of performance or the determinant of summit as previously thought it would be.
Interesting. Yeah. So we talked about what happens, but
Mm-hmm.
tell us, what does hypoxic training look like? When you talked about the different adaptations.
Yes. So hypoxic training's a bit of a weird one because we've got a couple of different arms, and again, it comes down to what suits somebody best and what's going to be the right port of call for them. Because there's two main arms that we use. One of those is prolonged exposure, or sleeping in a tent. That's where you
Mhm.
put the tent over your bed, have your hypoxic generator in your bedroom, and you create a semi-sealed environment around your bed or wherever it is you are, and you're in that for 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 hours at a time, and that's what stimulates that red blood cell growth, that EPO cycle that we spoke about, and that's arm one. Arm two is intermittent exposure, and that can be done in the resting state or in the active state. That's normally incorporated with exercise, just for a time efficiency point of view, to kill two birds with one stone, and that's all done via a mask-based system. So you pop a mask on if you're at home, or like we have here in London. I know there are a couple of them over in the States and things like that, or a big chamber, so a whole room at altitude, and that more looks at the adaptations around muscular adaptation. In terms of what it looks like, it very much depends on A, what somebody's level of risk is, B, where they're going to, and C, how quick they're trying to climb it. Because do you need to sleep in a hypoxic tent to go and climb Kili? 9 times out of 10, the answer is no, because it's just not got that much of the level of hypoxia experience there is high and enough to cause significant issues, but those issues can be kind of mitigated through intermittent exposure via a mask, rather than having to put a tent over your bed, because that's quite disruptive to everyday life. Equally, if you're looking at doing a very big expedition, things flip. We need to put that tent over the bed because we need to get a certain number of hours into you as an individual. It can range from kind of 2 to 450 hours, depending on what we need to do for a person, and we incorporate the intermittent exposure alongside that. If you're doing flash or rapid expeditions, we've got to do everything. It's as simple as that. Like, we are trying to make up for lost time. That is the whole point of a flash expedition. You, instead of spending 50 days on a mountain, you spend 30 days at home and 20 days on the mountain. Like, you don't lose time, you just use those 30 days differently.
Totally. Yeah. It's like training. I always feel like it can be hard here at home where I get a chance to sleep and recover, or it can be
Yeah,
hard on the mountain.
train
Yep.
hard, climb easy.
Yeah. That's what we all hope to achieve for sure.
Yeah.
You work with clients. I think it's important to say you're in London, obviously, but you work with clients from all over the world.
Yeah. So we had over 25 Everest summits this year from every single continent. So we are completely worldwide now, and
Amazing.
it's good fun. It's good fun. You see different cultures, climbing with different companies and things done different ways. And as long as everybody gets to the top, that's always the aim.
So, what mistakes do you see people making when it comes to acclimatization, either if they're training hypoxically or if they're not?
It's probably a similar one to you see with training. I think one of the biggest things people do is they underestimate mountain because, like, we get it all the time. Right here all the time going, the word only. The word only really bugs me. I'm only doing Everest Base Camp. I'm only doing Kili. This case, like, that's not an only. That's a pretty significant challenge. Like, compared to what
Yeah.
people in the general population, that's a big old challenge. Like, just because
Yep.
your 85-year-old grandma's climbed it doesn't mean that it's easy. So probably the biggest mistake we see is people underestimating the challenge and therefore under training for it. I think that's the
Hmm.
biggest one. In terms of issues or mistakes people see with pre-acclimatization or hypoxic machines, it's trying to go too high too fast and forgetting the basics. Like if you're on the mountain, you wouldn't spend your first night at 6,000 meters. You would just helicopter into Camp 1 on Everest and just sleep there. So why would you do it with a hypoxic tent? You know, it works in exactly the same way. We start nice and low, we build up slowly. We have those rotations, we have easy days, we have hard days. And we use the technology and the equipment as an addition to, not instead of. So what I
Hmm.
mean by that is the altitude fits you, not you fit the altitude. So if you've got a zone 2 run to, or you've got a zone 2 bike ride to do, fantastic. Let's do altitude. Let's not drop that run or ride and do something else. Let's just add the altitude to that so we can kill two birds with one stone and then get that altitude to match the aim of the session. So what I mean from that is if you've got an athlete doing a zone 2, zone 3, zone 4 bike ride, which is about physiological adaptations or fitness, then let's have the altitude nice and low, 2 to 3,000 meters, and let's try and squeeze an extra couple of percent out of that workout. If
Yep.
we've got an athlete doing an incline treadmill walk aimed at getting them ready for summit night, so very low intensity, quite long, carrying a rucksack, well, let's get them doing that at 4, 5, 6, 7,000 meters if we can, and replicate exactly what they're going to be seeing on the summit. So it's about being smart with the technology and being smart with the type of session we're doing, and then matching the altitude to the aim of the session, not making the session match the altitude.
And I think being smart is really important because when you start layering in hypoxic training, someone
Yeah,
who's maybe training for Everest, it's a lot for an individual to do. They're also working, have a family,
yeah. You've
life.
got to be time efficient. If we can kill 2 or 3 birds with one stone, everybody wins. Me as a physiologist gets the adaptations I need. You as a
Yep.
coach get the physical adaptations you need, and the athlete gets time to spend with their family.
Yeah.
So it becomes very much a more harmonious project when you look at mountains that big. For
Yep.
smaller mountains, you're well, not even small, but your smaller mountains, your Aconcagua, your Denalis, your Killies, your Everest base camps. It then very much becomes a case of, right, I need to get these hours in over this window. When can we do it, sort of thing?
Yep.
And it becomes much more condensed, much more short term because it's not so much of a long term project.
So, what advice would you give to someone who's, say, getting ready to be at altitude for the first time? We talked about what people get wrong.
If you're going to altitude for the first time, that's a very difficult one because there's not a huge number of places, a huge number of things you can do. What I would probably recommend, if you have the option or the availability to do so, there's a couple of sites like mine across the world. Not all of them specialize in high altitude mountaineering. Some of them specialize in fitness, for example. So they might be able to go to 3,000 meters rather than 6.5 the weekend here. Just try to get yourself to one of those sites, even if it's once or twice, and just get a feeling for what's coming your way. If that site offers any form of hypoxic testing, take it, because what you
Mhm.
can do is at least understand your level of risk. Because if it's really good, it's one less stress. Like the biggest thing that stresses people out is the unknown. You can get yourself fit, you can buy all the kit, you can check the weather forecast. Unless you go somewhere that does altitude, you can't find out how you're going to deal with altitude. So if you can remove that stressful element from the journey, you're only going to do yourself a favor. If the data indicates you're less at risk, keep doing what you're doing. Don't change anything if you're happy with what you're doing. If the data indicates you're more at risk, have a chat to the team wherever they are, and then they should be able to give you a hand in terms of mitigating and managing that risk.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. So the Hypoxico system was released, I don't know, 15 or more years ago, probably that it's
Probably
been.
longer than that, actually. Yeah.
Do you see any advances or any changes coming in hypoxic training?
can't see them coming in the near future because it works. Like at the end of the day, like we've proved it works. The independent research shows it works. The results on the mountain shows it works. Like the only other addition you could potentially look to add is around that pressurization that we've spoken about. But then you open to a whole new world of issues around kind of people flying, people diving. You take away the ability, unless some new technology is formed, of masks. You have to have full chambers or full like capsules built to withstand that. So I can't see that kind of changing too much. Actually, coming back to the question just before, actually, when you said somebody going to altitude for the first time, like we've only discussed the things to do before you go. Like I think it's really important if you're going to altitude for the first time, when you're on the mountain, there's some really clear things you need to do. The diving team will be really good with you on that. But the 4 golden rules we have here on site for when you're on the mountain, whether you've trained or not, whether you deal with altitude good or bad, no matter what's going on, is eat lots, drink lots, sleep lots, and go really, really slowly. Like no matter where you're climbing, what you're doing, who you are, how many times you've climbed, follow those 4 golden rules. Eat lots, sleep lots, drink lots, go really, really slowly. So I think that's how I look at it for somebody the first time. You've got pre-trip and then you've got during trip. Split them up, do what you can do, and then go and have an amazing time, because that's why we love climbing at the end of the day, is to go to the mountains and be away from and be in nature and be in that environment.
Yeah, I call all of those things self-care. And I would
Mm-hmm.
add to that not to let any little thing like a blister or a sore muscle
Yep.
or anything with your body start to linger, because at altitude, it's not going to resolve itself.
Nope.
Your body's not going to heal.
Nope.
And it can very quickly, a blister, or I've seen a hemorrhoid, end someone's climb because they're not
Yep.
taking care of.
We call it control the controllables. Yeah.
Right. We went through a lot of stuff really fast, Nick. I appreciate your expertise and experience. Can we sort of close with, what is your favorite story about elevation? Is there some experience you've had? Because I know you climb as well, or some
Yeah, that's a
scenes.
difficult one because we've done some really cool things. I'm really lucky to have worked on some really cool projects. I think my favourite, I wouldn't say story, but my favourite situation is when the unsuccessful summit becomes a success. So what I mean by that is you've got somebody, and it really doesn't matter the mountain, it really doesn't, who's tried, failed, and then succeeds. So
Mm-hmm.
I've worked on people who've had really bad situations on Killy. They've been evac off Killy, and then suddenly they've come, they've trained, they've got their photo at their top, they've had that once in a lifetime experience that we've been lucky enough to have, and they've had no issue. We've had people who've tried 2, 3, 4, 8,000, just never got there. Go back a 5th time, they get their summit, they get that sense of achievement. They've put that monkey to rest. The other thing that I find amazing about the mountaineering world we live in is just there are no boundaries now. We're recording this, was it 23rd, 24th of October? We've just been lucky enough to witness Shisha Pangya finally be climbed by a lot of people that I know have been waiting for it to be climbed by. We've had a couple of clients now who've finished the 14. Like,
Yep.
that's incredible. When I started this job 5, 6 years ago, like, that was ridiculous. Like, the 14 wasn't a thing. You had the 7 summits, and the 14 wasn't even, and when I say the 14, for those who don't know, sorry, they're the 14 8,000ers. So there are 14 mountains over 8,000 meters, climbing all of them. Like, what comes next? Like, where can we go from now? Like, we've had people do the 14 with O2. We've had people do the 14 non-O2. Records just seem to be broken left, right, and centre at the moment. It's really exciting to see, and I just hope that the mountains keep their mystery. They keep the love that we've got for them, and it doesn't just become meaningless is the wrong word, but emotionless. Like, oh, I've climbed K2. Oh, I've climbed Everest. Like, I don't want that to become a normal thing, because it's really not. I don't think it will, because people still have so much respect for them. But it's amazing to see how technology, both what we do, clothing, kit, medicine, training, all these elements have come together over the last few years to make these sort of projects possible. Like, people have linked, it's like the 4-minute mile that Roger Bannister ran, the sub 2-hour marathon that Eliud Kipchoge ran. Like, these things were never possible, but suddenly science and technology and training and mentality have now meant that it's now doable. So for me, I wouldn't say like there's a favourite story, so to speak, but it is that I'm just always in awe of climbers. Like, I really am. Like, I've climbed myself and I still step back, and you've got to go, fair play. Like, I know how hard it is to get yourself to that position and do it, and then to watch them go and do it. You just got to step back and go, do you know what? That's absolutely fantastic. Like, you've put the hard work in, you've got the summit, and that's because you deserve it. Nobody else. Like, it's not me. It's not your guide. It's not anybody else. Like, yes, all of those people have helped you. You wouldn't have got there without them, but you still put the hard yards in. You're the one who's got up at 5 o'clock in the morning to go for that run. You're the one who's, missed out on family events to get that session done, or been late to things. Like, you deserve that something because you've put the work in to get there. And the mountain's the biggest equalizer. Like, if you don't put the work in, you're not going to summit. And it's as simple as that.
Yep. And I appreciate too, Nick, that you mentioned respect, because it is amazing to see multiple 8,000ers climbed
Yep.
in a season, all 14 of them being climbed without oxygen.
Yep.
But I, like you, want the mountains to still remain mysterious and
Yep.
difficult, and something that we aspire to
Yep.
and respect and learn from.
Yeah, and I think they always will be, because for 99.9999% of the population, like, they can never achieve that. But those
Right.
select few, it's incredible. Like, they deserve a huge amount of respect for what they have done and how
Yeah.
they have done it, because it's not easy. Like, they
No.
have respected the mountain, they have put the hard yards in at some point, and now
Yeah.
they can reap the rewards of it. Like, they show respect to the mountains and get the benefits. And as long as everybody keeps doing that, the mountains will still be climbed, and B, people are going to come home safe. And at the end of the day, that's the most important thing.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Nick. Is there anything else you want to share before we conclude for today?
No, no, nothing from myself. Thank you for having me, I
No,
guess.
my pleasure. Yeah, I appreciate it. I look forward to continuing to work together on the clients
Yes.
we share.
Yeah, we always seem to cross paths on silly
Yes,
projects.
it's a small world.
It is indeed. It is indeed.